Welcome to the webinar on the discussion on mainstreaming climate policy at the International Monetary Fund, hosted by Boston University Global Development Policy Center and RECOURSE. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. The GDP Center is a member of the Task Force on Climate Development and the International Monetary Fund. The task force is a consortium of experts from around the world utilizing rigorous empirical research to advance development-centered approach to climate change at the IMF. Launched in October 2021, the task force is an 18-month project to engage in and utilize rigorous empirical research to inform policies that align international financial stability, growth with global climate goals. RECOURSE is a Netherlands-based NGO that targets development finance as the means of influencing the wider investment community, financial flows, and governments to ensure inclusive environmental sustainability, social just and poor development. Since late 2019, it has been examining the role and impact that the IMF is having on fulfilling the climate objectives of countries in the global south, and has just published research on IMF policy advice and how it impacts countries' fulfillment of their climate objectives. My name is Lavish Bhandari. I am a senior fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP in New Delhi, where I lead and develop climate change capability. So I'll take a couple of minutes to just describe the event. Why is this event titled Make or Break? Because as the only multilateral rules-based institution charged with promoting the stability of the international financial and monetary system, the IMF will have a central role to play in the transition to a low carbon and resilient global economy. The 2021 UN Climate Change Conference, or COP26 in Glasgow, has reinvigorated efforts to limit global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees. The IMF's surveillance, lending, and capacity building roles provide an unparalleled connection to the finance ministers and the central banks of virtually every nation. Consequently, how nations seek to meet their climate commitments will be shaped or even limited by the fund. Additionally, discussions at the G20 and other ministerial meetings are ongoing for an IMF-held Resilience and Sustainability Trust to channel a portion of this year's $650 billion US dollar allocation of special drawing rights towards climate initiatives, meaning the IMF would oversee potentially tens of billions of dollars in climate-related financing that could be crucial to fulfilling the ambitions of the COP26 meetings. With its universal role and influence over economic policy, the fund can make or break countries' COP26 related commitments, raising questions we will pose today to our panel, including how should the fund mainstream climate change policy into its work? Capitalizing on the COP26, which priorities should shape the IMF's new climate strategy? And how can we ensure the fund's approach protects a green and inclusive recovery, above all in developing countries? Joining us to discuss this are our four experts: Sarah Jane Ahmed, Shona Ryak, Sargon Nissan, and Daniel Tittleman. Sarah Jane Ahmed is a finance advisor for the Vulnerable 20 group of ministers of finance of the Climate Vulnerability Forum, a member of the Task Force on Climate Development and International Monetary Fund. She has worked on collaborative research on aligning and incorporating global climate strategy in international finance governance. She has previously been an energy financial analyst with the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis in the Philippines, covering energy transition and coal's stranded asset risk. Welcome, Sarah. Shona Ryak is the UK Executive Director for the International Monetary Fund. She formerly held the role of International Director at HM Treasury, the UK's government Economic and Finance Ministry, wherein she worked on international policy making and led the team responsible for the development of environment, energy, and transport taxation. Sargon Nissan is the IMF program lead at Recourse, an independent nonprofit organization that advocates for accountability and ecological justice from financial institutions. In his role, he focuses on financial policy reform across private and public sectors. Before joining Recourse, he served as executive director of the Financial Transparency Coalition, where he led an international civil society network to promote transparency and accountability in the financial system to combat illicit financial flows. Daniel Tittleman is the director of the Economic Development Division of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean. In this role, he coordinates the joint program between ECLAC and the German Technical Cooperation Agency, or GTZ, titled Towards Sustainable and Equitable Globalization. Having previously served as coordinator of the Special Studies Unit of the Executive Secretary at the ECLAC, he is an expert on macroeconomic and financial policy, as well as financing for development issues. Welcome to all the panelists. I will now first, before starting off, just take a couple of minutes and go over the logistics. Before moving into the discussion with our panelists, I would like to note that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, and so a recording is immediately accessible. Please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu to ask your questions for the panelists. Please also give your name and affiliation. We will take the questions after the panelists' remarks, but feel free to enter your questions at any time during the discussion. So the first session would be for about 30 minutes, and it's essentially focuses on the question, why does the fund matter to fulfilling the climate objectives? Why should it engage with the issue? And I'm going to ask each of the panelists in no particular order to present their thoughts and views on the matter. I might also add that all the views being addressed or talked about here are personal, and they do not necessarily represent those of the organizations that the panelists are affiliated with. So going back to the question, the IMF has in the past year acknowledged its fundamental role in shaping how countries can fulfill their climate commitments, including a major revamp of its approach to surveillance. It has also proposed a sweeping strategy to integrate climate into its work, subject to the approval of budget increases that could dramatically increase its internal capacity and institutional expertise on how climate issues affect its core remit of macroeconomic policy. So I'll ask Sarah to go first, and the question that I would like you to address is: the Task Force on Climate Development and the IMF has set out a case for the fund to play a central role in the transition to a low carbon and resilient global economy. Why does the IMF matter to fulfilling the climate objectives set out this year, and most recently at the COP26?
Thank you, Lavish, for the question. So what we came back with from COP26 is consensus that there isn't enough finance on the table to enable our transition this decade, and the trillions of private sector capital announced at COP will not reach climate vulnerable economies without credit enhancement through guarantees or other de-risking tools. With the consequences of climate change becoming more alarming, it will be critical to grow the scope of the IMF strategy in order to match new and rapidly developing realities through a fit-for-purpose Bretton Woods system. While the IMF is currently fit to deal with financial shocks, for economies on the front lines of the climate emergency, the V20 cannot afford to wait for the physical shocks of climate change to transmit into the financial system. This is too late, it is reactive and expensive, which translates to economic losses and lives lost. Being able to pre-arrange finance and invest in resilience early means that we are not only averting losses and damages to the economy, and reduce lives lost, but we safeguard the hard-fought development gains. The IMF does need to equip itself to support countries in dealing with the physical shocks of climate change and complex transition risks. The current market volatility of fossil fuels and high spot prices will impact balance of supply and demand, and investor pressure to invest out of these industries will only continue to build. The IMF as an institution has political power to move or obstruct progress on the ground. High emitter laggard countries, for example, Australia, not only break the trust of the world or break the trust that the world has given them, but contribute to accelerating the climate impacts that climate vulnerable developing countries end up paying for in losses and damages. So the IMF coming in early to flag the risk of Australia's current trajectory means that Australia not only goes low carbon for the survival of climate vulnerable countries, but it also reduces the risk of damages to their own economy. IEFA research shows that failure for Australia to deliver on Paris compatible climate targets means a 6% reduction in their GDP, and the fossil fuel lock-in they're on will increase the net debt of New South Wales to 100% by 2060, which taxpayers ultimately will pay for. So the IMF must enable economic development strategies that help establish resilience at the heart of macroeconomic fundamentals while encouraging unprecedented global collaboration. Now that we're past COP26, we must now look to the delivery of climate ambition. And key to this is transparency on the implementation of climate finance through annual tracking conducted independently by the IMF, which is an ask of both the V20 and the Climate Vulnerable Forum, through the delivery plan of climate finance, and for the IMF to contribute in ascertaining the most efficient composition of climate finance, taking into consideration debt sustainability and investment in adaptation required this decade. Our world is clearly interconnected in trade and supply chains, in investment, food, raw materials, process, consumption. Climate vulnerable economies and communities need to be climate proofed, and the 1.5 degree threshold of warming of the Paris Agreement must be a priority to safeguard global financial stability. Back to you, Lavish.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And in fact, that just gives me the cue for something that I would like Daniel to try and address, which is in light of the complexity of the international economic and governance architecture. Where can the IMF add the most value in tackling climate change in a manner that is complementary to partner organizations and also to multilateral institutions and national authorities? Daniel, you're muted.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Lavish, for the question. Well, addressing your questions, I just would like to go at this and taking advantage of Sarah's answer. Would like to emphasize and remember that addressing climate change challenges is a huge and requires a huge mobilization of resources. Okay, and at the same time, it requires a holistic vision of development, which has to integrate macro financial issues and developmental issues, because the efforts in order to change the production patterns as well as the energy matrix that powers our economies requires a large capacity to finance new investment and at the same time upgrade the existing capital stock. And at the same time that we have to face the financial needs for that, we have to make big efforts to compensate for both social and economic transition costs, which are highly relevant in developing countries. So in this sense, I just want to focus that the key element where we think that the IMF should be thinking how to involve is from a more holistic perspective of macroeconomic and financial issues and developmental issues that will be highly integrated when we're thinking about climate change. In this respect, also, as Sarah mentioned it, we have to take into account the different capacity, countries' capacity to address this challenge and in terms of our adaptation and mitigation. Hence, you need an IMF that can also and other international partners that can take into account this difference of policies and trying to mitigate spillover effects and equate more the global cost of this. And related to a more specific of your questions, we think that the IMF can play a catalytic role in bolstering climate change and sustainable development financing, as I said, not only from a macro financial perspective, but also from a developmental perspective. And in this respect, we think that there's a big opportunity to incorporate in the IMF a climate change perspective, not only in surveillance, but also in its lending programs. And this will require to enhance the development perspective of an international financial institution as a whole, with the IMF, but also other financial institutions. And this will require a change in the objectives and criteria of its lending strategy for developing, including middle-income countries. This will also require the adaptation of a longer time framework of its lending program. I mean, I think that a key element that the IMF can put into the table is to change the financial strategy, not only of the IMF in terms of its lending and surveillance, but also of other financial institutions to incorporate a longer term perspective, which is what climate change requires, given the investment challenge. And by mainstreaming a climate change and sustainable development, the IMF could also help aligning financing policies and other institutions and private markets to the same objective. I think that a key element that is being under debate now, and we saw it in the COP26, is that there is not a clear definition of what is climate change financing. And an institution like the IMF would have a very important role in helping define it. What do we mean by climate change financing? How do we mobilize those resources, the type of instruments we should be putting, and giving this, we think a more medium and long-term perspective to that challenge. It's not only a problem of macroeconomic and financial stability in the short term, but also a problem of financial and macroeconomic stability that can support a development process. And there's where the IMF could play a very important role through its surveillance, but also its lending strategies, trying to incorporate it more medium and term space. And just to end up, as came out of the COP26, there is a commitment to mobilize 100 billion by the developed countries, but this commitment, there is no agreement in what constitutes climate finance and how we will be moving that. And I think that the IMF can play a very important role on that. Thank you very much, and back to you.
Thank you, Daniel. And I'd like to take up on one of the points that you had made, and I'd like Sargon to comment on this. The IMF has engaged with non-traditional issues, such as inequality and gender, for several years, whenever it considers them to be macrocritical. So what is the fund's responsibility to its members vis-a-vis the climate?
Excuse me, I couldn't hear you too well. I'm having problems with, I don't know if the signal.
Okay, I'll repeat. This is a question for Sargon. The IMF has engaged with non-traditional issues such as climate, inequality, and gender for several years, whenever it considers them to be macrocritical. So what is the fund's responsibility to its members vis-a-vis the climate?
Thank you, Lavish.
Or are you still having problem?
I can hear you clearly. I'll go ahead. The question is to me, is it?
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I believe, I think it's legitimate to recognize and congratulate the IMF for its acceptance of its responsibility, and not just in terms of the rhetoric, perhaps, that is garnering headlines, but also in terms of substantive and specific policy processes that they have initiated. For example, the comprehensive surveillance review incorporating climate earlier this year, and efforts including a recent policy paper that set out a strategy, an institutional strategy, if you will, for how they could support members on climate more systematically, that recognized that hitherto it had been ad hoc. So I think that's a sort of mixed bag in the sense that the IMF has actually talked about climate change since 2015 and the Paris COP meetings in that year. So I think while I recognize that progress and in answer to your question, I think they do have to confront climate change. I would point to the remarks from Sarah and Daniel that preceded me as very important regarding their points on time horizon and in the work that the IMF does, not just as a lender, but as the leading macroeconomic international coordination institution. This will pose challenges that, from civil society's perspective, are longstanding and familiar work concerns, such as its even-handedness, its ability to, as the Comprehensive Surveillance Review set out an ambition that the board has yet to fully endorse, to also monitor the 20 biggest emitters' impact on other countries through its surveillance. And I think that's a laudable but a major challenge, because we've seen historically the IMF has sometimes had less traction in its biggest shareholders. So also, I think the complexity of its relationship to middle-income countries, who are often highly vulnerable to climate change's impacts and not at all responsible for the impacts they're feeling, but are often excluded from other sources of climate finance, a major issue that came out of Glasgow and is still unresolved. So I think that it's a difficult question, because the implication of my response is more resources and more authority and legitimacy to the IMF. But I think the only way I would be comfortable with that is if I saw a massive ramping up in the transparency and accountability with which the IMF dealt with these issues than it has historically been accustomed to providing. And that means countries are responsible to their for their climate commitments to their citizens and to the international community in summits such as the COP meetings that we just saw. So the IMF, I believe, has to broaden its horizon. We've published this morning research on how the IMF is highly influential, not just when it lends to countries, but also through its policy advice functions, meaning bilateral surveillance and technical assistance, which it provides overwhelmingly to low-income countries. And to really embed climate change into its work, it will have to, and we recommend that it be required to consider national climate commitments, such as nationally determined contributions, the emissions targets that every country has signed up to articulate since the Paris Agreement 6 years ago. And so the final point I would make is I worked on some of these issues since the previous managing director, Christine Lagarde, elevated them. And my concern as well is how does the institution embed this and not rely so heavily as it has done, I think, in the past on the leadership and individual commitment of the senior staff at the IMF, so that we don't see this pass with evolutions in the institution, because it faces a number of significant challenges, not least in the wake of the pandemic. And so that we don't want to put a recovery in opposition to a sustainable pathway for especially citizens, poorer citizens and poorer countries, and poorer citizens within countries. So I think remains a lot that is unresolved about this, Lavish.
Thank you, Sargon. I'm going to take up on one of the points that you had made a bit later, and that's about the challenges within IMF. But before we do that, I'd like Shona to just address this particular question that I've been having on this, that the UK has been playing a very proactive role this year on global policy making, with the G7 presidency and, of course, hosting the COP that just finished. As a board member overseeing the IMF for a number of years, is it appropriate, and how well equipped is the IMF as an institution to take on the leadership position on climate, given that it has a core function lending to countries in the balance of payment crisis and, of course, conducting multilateral surveillance to avoid future global crises?
Thank you, Lavesh, and thank you very much for inviting me to be on the panel today. It's a real pleasure. As you said, the UK has played a key leadership role this year, and we're very proud of what's been achieved, particularly at COP. And I'm sure the incoming chairs of both the G7 and the G20, Germany and Indonesia, will be keen to carry on that work. But if as a global community, we're going to be successful in meeting the challenge, we do need all of the international organizations to step up and to play their part. To my mind, the leadership of Kristalina Georgieva the leadership that she's providing is really crucial here, both within the fund and in the public global debate. She has responded to calls from the membership for the fund to step up, and she's been very clear on the need for the fund to embrace the transition to a new climate economy. Lavesh, as you said in your introductory remarks, the fund's primary responsibility is to protect and promote monetary, macroeconomic, and financial stability. This is a unique and essential role that the fund plays, and it plays it for the good of the whole international community. But the change that we have seen over the last few years is on the debate of where climate change sits in that role, and a recognition that climate change is a systemic risk, both to individual countries and to the global economy. And therefore, there's now a broad recognition that the fund can't fulfill its mandate without properly considering climate change and the associated policies. And here I very much agree with Daniel's point on the importance of the fund engaging with both short and longer term macroeconomic stability questions. It's easy to identify the role that the fund needs to play, but it is hard to do it in practice and to find a way for the fund to work that adds real value for its members and is consistent with the fund's mandate and with its expertise. And as an institution, we've come a long way in a relatively short space of time, but as Sargon points out, there's still more that we need to do to really embed climate change in a measured and helpful way, and to embed it systematically into the fund's work. And a huge effort is underway to achieve that. We're recruiting new staff. A huge amount of work is ongoing to skill up the existing staff to improve their knowledge and understanding of climate issues. And this is all really important to the fund actually having a positive impact here. But fund work on climate change needs to be anchored in its mandate. And that means sticking to the macroeconomic and the macro financial dimensions of climate change and providing expert macroeconomic analysis and positive advice. And that needs to go across mitigation, adaptation, and transition management. So most obviously that will come through the fund's surveillance work, and that's where we've devoted the most effort in the last few years. That includes advocacy work, setting out the macroeconomic case for climate action, and advice on how to implement policies effectively, working very often in partnership with other organizations, and most notably the World Bank here. But I also agree that it can't be just about surveillance. Fund provided technical assistance can play an important role, including in helping countries develop more comprehensive and longer term plans for addressing climate change. And increasingly, we need to look at the fund's lending function and how we can introduce climate into that. The fund is not a development bank. It's a lender of last resort in balance of payment crises. But that doesn't mean that fund lending and programs should ignore climate change. And I think later in the discussion, we'll touch on the plans for the new resilience and stability trust that the fund is looking at. And the potential that has to play in providing funding to address the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. We have still about 10 odd minutes for this session, and I'd like to take up an issue which has been in a sense mentioned by everyone. I mean, Sarah, you mentioned that IMF needs to come in early. Sargon mentioned that there is for legitimacy you do need transparency. There's an issue about taking on the challenges that will be posed by the lack of specific commitments on the 100 billion that Daniel mentioned. So there are, in a sense, it seems that IMF will have to change. It's not just a matter of resources. It will have to change in how it functions. And and I'm sure that different people have thought about it in different ways, because this has not been the traditional mechanisms that IMF has been geared towards. So, I mean, Sarah, I mean, just if you have you thought about that? I mean, how can the IMF go in early when it's really not been its history to do that?
I think this is where the analytics is so important to understand how these risks transmit throughout the system, because it justifies the cost effectiveness of jumping in early rather than later. And prearranged financing, for example, disaster risk financing is a key issue and of the V20, and there is a G20 V20 inter-resilience global partnership to tackle this. And I think a missing stakeholder on the table is the IMF in this partnership. And so I think there is more of a role to be played, and we need to think through how they can come in early, considering their mandate and the cost effectiveness of them coming in early as well.
Thank you. Daniel, would you want to comment on this, or?
Yes.
You're muted. Yeah.
Yes. Well, basically, I just wanted to follow up a little bit on what is being said. And I think that the IMF plays a key role at the global level, also in defining the macroeconomic, fiscal, and financial framework of many of particularly developing countries. And the key element is how you're going to adjust the need of macroeconomic and financial stability to this new context of systemic risk coming from climate change issues. And I think that there the fund has a great opportunity, particularly for developing countries, in helping to expand the macro and the analytics of the macroeconomic and financial concept of stability and challenges. And I think that a key element is that we have to move towards what we have called a development macroeconomics within the financial and macroeconomic stability issue. And let me give you an example. Many fuel oil exporting countries from developing countries will have fiscal problems as they move to the net zero target. But at the same time, they will have great demand for investment and difficulties to mobilize private investment and private financial flows. So you have to be able to incorporate this new reality in the fiscal programs of countries in order for them to allow them to move towards macroeconomic stability, but at the same time, they move towards the investment requires and the financial needs that they will require for investment in climate change. So there's challenges in terms of how we're going to adjust our macroeconomic framework to the new developmental challenges. And I think that there where the IMF can play an important role, given that it's been shaping many of our macroeconomic frameworks in countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Sargon, I'd like you to just elaborate a little bit more on this whole point about for legitimacy, you need more transparency. How can the IMF change in that respect?
Well, I can respond.
I'm having a problem hearing you.
Which is to say,
I'm having a problem hearing you. Can everyone hear him?
Should I continue?
Okay. So I'd suggest if you can shut off your camera, because we are having a problem.
Absolutely. Can you hear me now? Can I go ahead?
Yes, better.
Thank you. The low-hanging fruit I was referring to is the sorts of work that the IMF has done to discussing the sustainability of fossil fuel taxation and incentive subsidies, the chapter in the 2020 World Economic Outlook, for example, released at the annual meetings of that year. I think that when we get into the specifics of the IMF's impact, we may have more of a challenge will be on the sorts of work that Shona also mentioned on technical assistance and surveillance. I believe that the IMF will have to dramatically broaden its engagement with stakeholders in country when it conducts surveillance and technical assistance. We advocate that the IMF should be compelled or obligated in its climate strategy to take into account not just the nationally determined contributions that I mentioned already, but also national climate policies, and that should be part of the assessment that the IMF does, as well as this transition risks that Daniel mentioned. There are many countries that are still being encouraged for reasons of domestic revenue mobilization, as well as for export hard currency earning to have fossil fuel investments. And I think this role that the IMF plays in sometimes not knowing what one country's left hand is doing with its right hand and so on is no longer sustainable. And I think this is where the ad hoc approach that the IMF policy paper acknowledged would need to transform itself to be systematic integration of climate across all of its functions, including in lending in the terms which I just described as for policy advice, but actually probably pertains to the whole institution's engagement with its members.
Thank you, Sargon. Shona, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, I agree with much of what Sargon has just said. I think it's important to remember that the fund is a members-based institution. We have 190 memberships and members, and one of our great strengths is the breadth of the membership and the breadth of the coverage. But it means that the decisions that the fund institutionally makes about how it's going to operate and what it's going to do need to be made on a consensus basis with the broad support of the membership. So the commitments that have been made and the commitments to a change in approach that have been made are quite extraordinary, that we've managed to get the whole membership, including big fossil fuel producers, to acknowledge that these issues are macro critical and that the fund needs to be looking at them. You know, in terms of kind of coming in early, I agree with Sarah that surveillance is really has to be central here, because the thing about Article 4 led surveillance is it happens in every country every year. So it's really a unique tool to get a picture of what's going on in country, and becoming increasingly systematic about looking at climate issues, both mitigation and adaptation in those Article 4 reports, really provides a basis both for further fund work and also for work that countries themselves can be doing and focusing on. Lending is more of a challenge, and it's really important to remember here that the fund's mandate is very clear that it can only lend when there is a balance of payments need. Increasingly, the way that we are thinking about this is that for some countries, the climate challenges that they face will in and of themselves create a balance of payments need, even if it's a kind of future-looking balance of payments need rather than an immediate one. So there's more that the fund as an institution needs to do to think about how it lends and how its lending can support countries in these efforts. And I think it's really important here to be clear that some sorts of support and some sorts of financing should be done by other institutions and not by the fund. But I do agree that there's more that the fund can and should be doing.
Thank you. I think this whole question about what the fund should be doing was essentially just to kickstart discussion. I mean, it is obvious that the fund needs to play a very not just a proactive role, but a leadership role in this whole this thing. And one of them is to also going to facilitate or make it easier for other institutions to contribute. So I'd like to now move on to the next session, which is essentially going more into the specifics of it. So in January, MD Georgieva set out the Climate Adaptation Summit, how the IMF will seek to integrate climate into A, economic surveillance, B, financial stability assessment, 3, the capacity development it provides to members, and D, its data provision. Plans for advancing for an IMF-held resilience and sustainability trust to receive perhaps up to $50 billion of this year's $650 billion allocation of special drawing rights. The IMF would oversee potentially tens of billions of US dollars in climate-related financing that could be crucial to fulfilling the ambitions of COP26 meetings. The question, and I'd like Sargon to go first, is how should the fund mainstream climate change policy into its work? What priorities should shape its effort, move from an ad hoc to a systemic approach to climate, as the fund's own proposed climate strategy suggested? And one more thing, one logistics thing, in this particular session, I would like, in the middle, if someone wants to comment on something, please do raise your hands. And thank you. Sargon, you're muted, it seems. No, you're not. We can't hear you. You may want to.
Hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely, loud and clear.
Fantastic. Apologies for that. I seem to be having some technical issues today. Regardless, the challenge, I think, for the IMF is partly the issues I've already listed in terms of integrating systematically across its work. In light of the trust that you mentioned, I think it makes some of these challenges far more acute. Shona mentioned that the IMF has as its principal and core role, providing liquidity and dealing with balance of payments crises. But the intention about and of course we can't be certain what that is. We've heard a lot from not just the ND, but also the G20 and the International Monetary and Financial Committee, the governors of the IMF in October, all pointing to the RST as an important source of recovery and sustainable recovery financing. I think that there's, first of all, a risk that I want to point out, which is to say that in terms of climate finance, that this doesn't become something which seeks to cannibalize or misrepresent itself. From what we know about the RST, this is not a donor fund, this will be lending, and that I think raises concerns about it being misrepresented in that way. I appreciate that wasn't your question. I think it's something that when we talk about it, we have to be really careful that it does not get confused with that role. And I don't think, this isn't an accusation of the IMF who haven't made those sorts of remarks. So just to be really clear. But what that does mean for the IMF is, I think, really important to talk in terms of the time horizon issue that Daniel and Sarah mentioned at the outset, because I do believe that at times we do see trade-offs between the importance of returning to international markets and to enable countries to be able to support or sustain external investment and support to their balance of payments, whereas those pressures may preclude being able to sustain the kind of public investment, whether it's internal or from international sources, as those $100 billion commitments reflect, to transition into a net zero or low carbon economy, to invest in renewable energy. And I think this is one of my major concerns about the interaction of the IMF with other institutions and within the global economy, and whether it has structured itself, it has the time horizon, both in the surveillance it conducts, in the structure of lending and loans. And, I think we can think of plenty of countries which have had a number of loans provided to them over decades that seem to be chronic borrowers from the IMF, and that it seems to be cyclical in both, across the global South. So I think that to integrate systematically will require a really difficult and profound cultural shift It also, I think, one thing I'll be looking out for is how the IMF interacts with middle income and its biggest shareholders in terms of that surveillance function. And particularly the ambition to monitor the 20 largest emitters by greenhouse gas emissions is one that I think is becoming almost emblematic of whether the international community and the membership permits the IMF to do that. And then it will raise those secondary questions about, one thing at civil society we're concerned about is we do want the IMF to recognize its implications for inequality, social protection, gender rights, and things that it has talked about for a number of years alongside climate. But that does not mean we think the IMF should be the determining institution about what a feminist economy looks like, what a sustainable economy looks like, and it needs to act with a high degree of humility and collaborativeness if it's going to achieve these goals.
Thanks, Sargon. I'd like Shona to address one of the points which Sargon had mentioned. The G20 has called on the IMF to establish the RST, or the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. What should this RST help achieve, given that there are clear calls to focus on climate investment, an area where the World Bank and other development agencies perhaps might be more suited? What should be the IMF's role?
Thank you. So, my starting point here would be the importance of acknowledging that the $650 billion SDR allocation that went ahead this summer was an incredibly important step for the fund to take in terms of addressing the issues that the global economy and individual members were facing in respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that was an incredibly important starting point. But like all SDR allocations, it went to all active IMF members and had a really important role in terms of boosting global liquidity. But the RST potentially is one way that we're looking at to try and magnify the impact of that allocation by providing a new vehicle through which countries like my own have the potential to recycle some of their SDR allocation, and which has the potential to address longer term challenges that countries are facing. We are still at the beginning of the discussions about how exactly it will work, and many of the design issues around it are still under close discussions. But the vision certainly that the UK has for this is that the RST would play a complementary role to traditional IMF programs, and crucially that it would provide financing on a longer term basis than is available through fund programs. Sargon is absolutely right that fund lending will always be lending rather than grant financing, and we shouldn't try and hide that fact. That is the way that the fund operates, and it's the way that we would envisage the RST operating. But providing lending on a longer term maturity has the potential to support countries to address balance of payments needs that come as a result of climate change, where longer term structural change, where longer term investment is needed. So if we are successful in creating an RST which is effective and which is well resourced, we do believe that it can provide an important role in supporting members facing these challenges, but it's not going to be the be all and end all, and there certainly will be an important role for development banks and other sorts of development finance to support climate investment, because they are able to provide financing in a format that the fund can't. And if the RST is going to be effective, I also agree with Sargon's point that the fund needs to be working collaboratively with other institutions to really support countries and to provide financing which really supports them in the needs that they make. Because on many of these issues, particularly on climate, other institutions such as the World Bank and authorities themselves and civil society all have a much clearer understanding of what's needed than the fund does. Thanks.
Thank you, Shona. I'd like Daniel to just address this one question, which is actually right, it lies at the root of it all. What are the challenges for countries in the global south, specifically, especially on the low-income countries and the highly vulnerable states that are on the front line of a crisis that they obviously did not create?
Well, thank you, Lavish. That's just trying to narrow a little bit my answer in a few minutes. I will say that we have to, as been mentioned by Sargon, Shona, and also Sarah, we have to take into account that the starting point from developing countries and most vulnerable countries is not the best one in order to address climate change issues. We have a structural gap problems, inequality, poverty, low investment rates. I mean, we have a dynamics which is very already hard to deal with. And on top of that, we have to address climate change issues, which is very, and which will require a lot of investment efforts and a lot of financing, which are structurally lag behind in many of our countries. So first of all, we have to, I think, realize that the starting point of many developing countries is not the best one in order to start addressing climate change issues. At the same time, you address simultaneously your historical structural problems. So we have to make a double effort in that sense in terms of catching up and at the same time moving towards a new development paradigm. So from that perspective, I think that from the global south, a first issue that should be taken into account is that the cost and the spillover effects have to be taken into account when you are designing global strategies. And global institutions like the IMF and other institutions should take into account the specificities of countries when addressing climate change from their growth and fiscal dynamics. Many countries in the region, in Latin America, for example, will have much less fiscal space given the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are now for the next few years, and I will say more than the next few years, facing a limited fiscal space, low growth performance, deepening of poverty and social issues. And at the same time, we have to face climate change, transformation, and investment. And we are starting from a very low investment rate to GDP, like in Latin America is about 17%. So these structural changes has to be taken into account when you are designing financial policies for climate change issues. And that, just to finish, let me give you one example which relates to the RST that was being mentioned before. Caribbean seas have a very big problem with public debt, which doesn't reflect macroeconomic mismanagement. It reflects natural catastrophes. Seas countries in the Caribbean seas in Latin America have to get more debt to replace capital and investment that is being destroyed by natural catastrophes. So it's like a snowball that grows and grows. So when you are addressing, and the IMF has a lot to do on that, debt relief initiatives, for example, we have put on the table what we call a debt swap for climate change investment for the Caribbean seas, where we try to link macroeconomic stability, debt stability issues, and longer-term investment, as Shona was mentioning. So I think that from the deep south, from the south, and for example, with the Caribbean seas example, a key element is how are we going to link structural issues with financing and with macroeconomic stability from a perspective that allows you to move on time, facing more simultaneously a lot of these issues. If you're leaving some of the issues behind, probably you will not be able to make all the transformation, the structural transformations you need in order to face climate change challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, you have worked a lot on the same question.
Yes, just to add on to what Daniel has already said, the IMF as an institution, has this political power to move progress on the ground. This means that a lot of their existing tools, like the debt sustainability assessment, should take into consideration the reality that we have conditions currently that don't allow climate vulnerable developing countries to invest in domestic adaptation. And that we need to figure out an assessment that enables them to do that. The other point just on the RST is that it certainly should be eligible to low income and middle income countries that face climate physical or transition risks. And the RST should not be confined for use for countries with existing IMF programs, because it may be, such as the Caribbean SIDS, it was a natural disaster that caused the instability. And just to echo a prominent B20 member, the Honorable Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, during the opening of COP26, she made an important point just on central banks of the wealthiest countries engaging in $25 trillion of quantitative easing in the last 13 years, and $9 trillion of that in the last 18 months. And she highlighted that had we used $25 trillion to purchase bonds to finance the energy transition, we would be keeping to the 1.5 degree limit, the Paris Agreement. And so she was calling for an annual increase in SDRs of 500 billion for 20 years to be put in a trust to finance this transition, and highlighted it as an opportunity to support climate vulnerable countries. And 500 billion is just 2% of the 25 trillion that was used. So certainly, the financial ability could be made available, but also pointing back to Daniel's points that we have to have that framework in place as well to ensure that it's done in a sustainable manner.
Thank you. Daniel, Sargon, I'd like you to just come back to this issue of middle income countries and what are the different set of challenges for them?
I think that the challenges that they face relate to a number of factors. First of all, they often do not qualify for existing forms of support, ODA, and are treated as if they have essentially the capacity, depth, and have gone beyond issues of poverty or inequality, or that they should be entirely able to address those through their own internal resources. And I think that oftentimes, and I think Sarah has made some very important points. And if you look at the membership of the Climate Vulnerable Forum and the Vulnerable Group of 20, some of those countries are middle income countries. And so the expansion of the support through the RST, as I do believe is being envisaged, to not be restricted as other forms of specialized trust in the IMF, like the Poverty Reduction Growth Trust, are limited to low-income countries. That's, I think, appropriate. But a letter signed by almost 300 civil society organizations issued earlier this year in the wake of the allocation set out a number of principles, which I believe it's worth mentioning at this stage, that should apply equally to middle income and low income countries, to do with how these resources are channeled into an RST trust or elsewhere, because countries can, of course, provide their SDRs bilaterally or directly at their own discretion, those countries that are lucky enough to have a significant surplus. And that those principles included that these would not be debt creating, that they would not come through with conditionalities. And I note that there is a specific question. Both questions are to you, Shona, I'm afraid, though that I suppose comes with the territory given your role. But one question from our co-host organization, Kevin Gallagher, the director of the GDP Center, points out, what is the logic of what we've heard so far regarding the RST being restricted to countries that are already in existing IMF programs. And this pertains, Lavish, to middle income countries because of the huge expansion of the IMF's footprint as a result of the pandemic. And we've seen, I think, when I last looked at the IMF website, it pointed to over $118 billion in emergency lending that it had provided just during the pandemic alone to 87 countries. So this is no longer the IMF that in 2007 was receiving interest payments only from one country, Turkey. This is an institution whose presence and role is about as universal as it gets. So if it is shaping or acting in a way as a gatekeeper of the provision of these funds, it really needs to take into account the purposes that and the issues and context which Sarah and Daniel just set out.
Thanks, Argon. Before Shona responds to those questions, let me just again underscore that these are all personal views and nothing being addressed here are organizational views. So Shona, with that, I think the stage is yours on those questions.
Yeah, okay, so there's quite a lot there. The RST, as I said, it's still under discussion what it's going to look like. So none of these issues are decided yet. It is true, I think, that it is likely that that borrowing under the RST will be restricted to countries who have an IMF program, either an existing program or a new IMF program. It is also true what Sargon said, that I think the intention is that it would not be limited to it would not be limited to low-income countries in the way that the PRGT trust is. The intention is that it would cover a broader, it would provide support for a broader group of countries, including middle-income countries, and specifically looking at the design features to ensure that some of the small island developing states who people have raised specific concerns on, that those countries would be eligible to receive support under the RST. You know, I recognize that this point about linking it to an existing IMF program is a controversial one, and is one where there are different views on it. I think the thinking behind doing it in this way is that this comes back to the fund's mandate and the importance that anything that the fund does is linked to this core role around macroeconomic and financial stability. And the hope that, you know, if you look specifically at some of the small island states, one of the reasons why they haven't wanted to take out IMF programs in the past was because they felt that the amount of financing that would be available to them wasn't sufficient to make it attractive for them. One of the big advantages of the RST is that it would be, if it was linked to existing programs, it would be a top up to existing programs. So the total amount of financing that a country would be able to secure would be significantly greater. And the RST element of that would be available on a longer maturity and therefore effectively more concessional. So yeah, as I say, those items are still under discussion, but I think that's where we're likely to come out. And I guess the final thing I would say is that I think it's important to see the RST as one part of a broader picture. It's not going to solve all the problems. It's not the only answer. Once we have the SDR allocation, lots of countries, including my own, then have freedom to use those SDRs or to provide other financial support in any way that they choose to do it. So it could be giving it to the RST. The UK and some other countries have already said that we're going to recycle some of our SDRs into the PRGT because we believe that the funding that the PRGT provides to low-income countries is incredibly important, including for addressing climate vulnerabilities. SDRs can also, as Sargon said, be used bilaterally. They can potentially be used through the multilateral development banks. So, you know, I think the RST can play a really important part, but it's not going to be the whole answer and the whole jigsaw. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone wants to comment on that? Okay. So I think we are now getting ready for our last session, which is that of the Q&A, and we have some interesting questions. One of them actually has already been mentioned by Sarah, but I will again put it in front of the panel, which is the question is by Rebecca Ray. What reaction do our panelists have to Mia Mottley's suggestion in Glasgow that SDRs be increased by 500 billion annually? I'll start with Daniel.
I'm sorry, I'm having technical difficulties with the volume.
No
I didn't hear you well. I don't know if you want to start with somebody else while I try to fix this.
Okay, sure.
I'm sorry.
Sargon, would you want to start off with that? A reaction to the demand for an increase of $500 billion in SDRs.
Yes, I think I'm very sympathetic to it. Helpfully, there's a link now in the chat box to the principles I mentioned regarding the fair channeling of special drawing rights that was drawn up by a global coalition of civil society. And I think that the principles set out therein would apply to how we see the value of any future SDR allocation. I think it's worth noting, and it was really beautifully put by Prime Minister Motley, and thank you, Sarah, for raising it, that the relative value of the quantitative easing that rich countries have deployed. And I would actually make this analogy, Lavish, that the case for an increase in SDR allocations, notwithstanding the 2/3 of those allocations go to the richer countries, I think, as a rule of thumb. And a very small proportion ends up with the lowest income nations. The analogy, I think, is a little bit like vaccines and how short-sighted it has been for global North countries to hoard them, short-sighted even in terms of their own citizenship well-being. And I think the value of enabling countries to have the fiscal space and the capacity and depth of public investment and the time horizon to execute that sort of investment is a little bit like understanding why, until everybody is vaccinated, really everybody is under threat from the pandemic, because of the nature of the fact that, we are all in this together. And then in terms of the nature of the climate crisis in particular, the fact that it originates from global North industrialized countries overwhelmingly and absolutely in historical terms, makes that even stronger than in my analogy. So yes, I think that the importance of the SDR allocation that Prime Minister Motley called for is precisely because of the scale of the challenge and the need that, given the indebtedness levels that we've seen, and Daniel has, I think, helped, with this sobering point regarding the levels of indebtedness and the persistence of that debt, and hence why the principles in that letter, which I would encourage everybody to have a look at, are set out so clearly there, and why the points that Shona made regarding the use of the RST being, specific, limited, and complementary is, I think, absolutely true.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to comment on that? Okay. And next question is by John Sword. And it's related to the Bretton Woods project. I have a question for Shona. Do you have a sense of how climate change will be integrated into the guidance for IMF staff that is being created to implement the comprehensive surveillance review published earlier this year? It would be interesting to know more about what is being planned on transition management in particular, and whether the proposals set out in the IMF's climate strategy calling for increased surveillance in this area are likely to go forward in 2022.
So, I mean, the proposals in the fund's climate strategy on including climate issues and transition risks specifically into fund surveillance, that is already happening. So, you know, as somebody who sits on the board and sees Article 4 reports, FSAP reviews, the whole range of bits of IMF surveillance that comes to the board, we have already seen a step change in the coverage of these issues, including a staff note for the UK that was produced alongside our Article 4 last year. So certainly the guidance that will go to staff on implementation of the comprehensive surveillance review will include these issues. The point I made in my introductory remarks about the fact that there's also significant work underway to ensure that IMF staff have the skills and the expertise to be able to look at them. There's a huge effort going on there. It's also true that the comprehensive surveillance review was clear that exactly what is covered will vary depending on each country's individual situation. That has always been a principle behind Article 4 reports. We don't want them just to be an enormously long tick box exercise of a long list of things that need to be covered. So even if staff are looking at climate issues within a country, exactly what those issues, what issues are the most pressing and the most appropriate to be looking at in that country, whether it's adaptation, transition, mitigation, that will vary country by country. It is also true that at this stage, there is a voluntary element to this, and that if countries do not want this to be covered in their surveillance, then they will not be. You know, I've worked on IMF issues for more than 20 years, and I think that I would say from my experience that changes that we've seen in IMF surveillance don't happen overnight. So, for example, the publication of Article 4 reports, when that was first introduced, it was something that really only a small number of advanced economies did. And over time, it's become the norm. So it's now rare for Article 4 reports not to be published. So in terms of the coverage of climate issues, countries like the UK are very much seeking to lead by example and to say, you know, we want the fund looking at this in the UK. We want the fund giving us advice and support. And part of that is about setting a very clear example in the hope that over time we get to a stage where it's covered in all Article 4 reports, and in particular where the top 20 emitters have full coverage in their Article 4 reports. We're not going to get there overnight, but I think we're definitely moving in the right direction.
Thank you. The next question is from Kevin Gallagher. If a country has no internal macro problems in the present, would they then be able to get programs like the FCL and top-down with RST? Or are we talking about an SBA-like programs that would have been proven to be associated with low growth, inequality, and poor health and environmental outcomes? PM Motley noted that it just so happens that the SDR basket comprises of currencies from countries that are the highest emitters, except perhaps Russia. So this question is addressed to no one. Anyone wants to comment on this? Go ahead, Shona.
So I'm happy to take this because this is a more straightforward question. As I say, nothing on the RST is settled yet, but certainly the intention is that a fund program of any sort would count. So that would include precautionary programs. So a precautionary program being one where the country pre-qualifies because they're judged to have high policies in place, but they don't actually draw down on it. So yes, an FCL would certainly count.
Thank you. The next question is from Nadia Dar of Oxfam. In thinking about the RSTs linked to climate and collaborations with the World Bank, what are some of the examples of climate-based conditionalities or prior conditions do you foresee being part of the RST loans? Is there a way to accomplish climate-based objectives without it taking the form of conditionality? For example, through having parallel capacity development operations with the country in question. Again, I guess this question is addressed to you, Shona.
So the way that fund lending works is that it comes with conditionality attached to it. The RST will not be fundamentally different from that, but the sort of conditionality that will be attached to it would be different. It is possible to lend to countries for finance or to give grants to countries for finance for climate-related goals without conditionality attached, but you wouldn't do that through the IMF. You'd do that through the World Bank or through bilateral financing or through another organization. Exactly what the appropriate conditionality would be, I'm not going to seek to answer that because I don't feel well placed to give a good answer. The only thing I would say is that certainly, you know, the vision that the UK has on this is that it would, as with all fund lending, it would need to be properly country owned. So it would need to be things that the country itself was committed to doing. And in terms of considering the sorts of things that might be on the table, I don't think that the fund is currently well placed to come up with answers to that on its own. So it would need to work in partnership with the World Bank, who have much greater depth of expertise on this. Thanks.
Thank you. And that gets us to our time. So before I close this, any final remarks that anyone would like to make? So thank you. Thank you, Shona, Sargon, Sarah, and Daniel. It's been a pleasure. And I will not even try to summarize what we discussed here, but it's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Lavish, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.